The other question that often comes up is, what is it all about? What is amateur radio? Well, I'd like to offer an explanation as to where the expression ham came from, and also talk about amateur radio. And I've had a license since 1964, when I was 14 years old. Ham was sort of a derogatory or negative comment about a new operator on a telegraph, and that would have been in the late 1800s. The schools that taught telegraphy were called ham factories. The guys who came out of them were called hams. And it was generally kind of along the lines of being ham-handed, not very good with the hands. Sending good characters on a telegraph key is an art, and some guys can do it just incredibly well, others not so much. So the expression ham during telegraphy times was a poor operator. In about 1913 to 1915, as amateurs, radio operators started appearing on the scene, licensed by the radio service at that time. That was the Department of Commerce, I think. The expression ham radio started to carry over, rather the expression ham started to carry over to these operators. At that time, in 1913, 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, along in there, the guys who were transmitting signals were sending something called spark gap. There were two pieces of metal spaced at a correct distance. Some had carbon at the tips, I think. And they would generate really high voltages, and they would key that with a telegraph key. And so it would have this buzzing sound, this arcing sound. And they were sending signals to other guys who might be 100 miles away, might be 50 miles away, might be on the next street. And so for them, it was a thrill just to make contact with anybody. Their receivers were, at best, not much more than a crystal set, which had wide ranges of frequencies that they would hear at one time. And when these guys would transmit, their signals also were super wide. But as things evolved, and the use of really well-made homemade equipment and then commercial equipment, the kind of signal that was sent out improved dramatically. The expression ham carried forward into those operators, not so much in a negative way, but that they were experimenters. And today the expression ham radio operator is not negative at all, but it refers to somebody who is an amateur radio operator and has the appropriate license. Each country has its own regulations regarding transmitters and the ability for amateurs to get on the air. I think every country but one or two allow that these days. I think one of them is where it's not allowed is North Korea. So ham radio started off as a negative comment about amateur radio operators. So what is an amateur radio operator? First, there's three parts to my definition of what an amateur radio operator is, or what ham radio is. Number one, it is a licensed radio service, licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. The amateur radio operator has to pass an exam, and the number of amateur radio operators in the United States is somewhere north of 600,000, I think. They keep us around because, and we have a large number of frequencies, because during emergencies and during disasters, oftentimes, ham radio or amateur radio is the only means of communications. Why is that the case? Well, because ham radio operators practice for emergencies. Many have set up repeaters on UHF and VHF to convey messages. And right now in the adjacent two counties, there's a fire, and communications are being carried on as a backup to the fire departments by ham radio operators who have repeaters in place even though the power is down in large portions of Northern California, their equipment is battery operated or solar powered. So ham radio operators are ready for emergencies. I've done many during the years I've held a license. Most ham radio operators have participated in an emergency. What are those emergencies? Could be a fire, as is going on now. Could be a flood. It could be a snowstorm. Could be any dam breaking. Could be any number of things where ham radio operators step up. Oftentimes, it is a backup means of communicating. During the 49er fire, which was one that I was involved in for about a week, we provided secondary communications, maybe simple things like needing food being delivered to a camp where firemen were staging and would come in after being on the fire line for 2 days and would come in to eat and rest. Sometimes it's simple things like that. Other times it's reporting that a fire has crossed a line. Some ham radio operators will man a lookout tower and report on the progress of a fire. So emergencies. Number two, it is a incredible hobby with so many facets to that. I can't name them all, but those things include digital communications, where ham radio operators talk to each other using digital modes, where the signal is extremely weak, so weak that with my ears I can't hear it, but the equipment can dig that signal out of the noise and convert it to text that runs across a screen. Pretty amazing stuff. Sending pictures, talking to the space station, any number of things. Building antennas, designing antennas, building amplifiers, installing equipment. Just a huge range of things that amateur radio operators have used, incorporated into sometimes other hobbies, maybe flying in a remote control airplane. There are so many that it's just mind-boggling. The third part of amateur radio, so there's two parts. Number one, and most important, is it's a licensed radio service. Two, it's a hobby that is just incredible. There's no other hobby that has so many facets. Nothing. And three, another, and I'm going to say unique. Unique feature of amateur radio is the friendship that's made. Unlike other things that require a license, licensed amateur radio operators make friends in other countries around the world, and those friendships can last 50, 60 years. In my case, I've had some of those friends for over 50 years. So it's, and though the friendship that is developed means that one ham radio operator will do something to help another. It may be as simple as providing transportation in a circumstance, or explaining how something functions, or making a YouTube video to explain how to build or operate something. There are friends who just get together on a daily or weekly basis, meet on the air. Those friends could be in the United States. They could also be in the Middle East, or in Europe or Asia, Australia, New Zealand, in Oceania, anywhere on the planet. And given the radio propagation on HF and the variations in the sun's affecting communications, talk to those guys on a fairly frequent basis over the air, and having a good time doing it. Other ham radio operators get together on networks, and some of them have the purpose of providing emergency services. Others are just getting together and saying hi. So amateur radio is a licensed radio service. It's a hobby with just an incredible number of facets, and I've only mentioned a few. And three, and for me the most important part, is the friends and the friendships that go on for decades. That's what ham radio, amateur radio is. If you have a question about amateur radio, post that below. If you have a comment, put that below also. And if you haven't subscribed, I would highly recommend that you do. Amateur radio operators have a series of numbers. It's called the 92 code, and